Folks, we have a very special guest here. This is Michelle Nolan. If you're talking about old school, she's about as old school as you get when it comes to comic book collecting. She is going to tell the tale of collecting as a young kid all the way through to the very first Comic-Con, and she's been part of it all. So without further ado, Michelle, tell us your story.
Well, thank you, Keston and Dan. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Um, I'll just give you a quick highlights of my first 15 years. And this is when I thought I was the only comic collector in the world for a few years. And then I found out later that fandom was beginning in the 60s. So in 1956, I bought my first comic book off the rack. I was 8 years old, and it was Mystery in Space number 32 with giant aliens on the cover. And it had a story by a guy who became a great friend of mine later, Murphy Anderson, a well-known artist. In 1957, I began haunting the 3 downtown San Jose secondhand bookstores for old comics. And that was a thrill. In those days, you didn't worry about kids walking or taking the bus. There wasn't much crime. In 1958, my big memory of that year was finding roughly 100 old DC comics at one of the secondhand bookstores from the late 40s and early 50s. And they seemed ancient to me, but that was my first huge golden age discovery. My favorite character that came about that year was Adam Strange in Showcase number 17. In 1959, my favorite memories are the debut of the Silver Age Green Lantern in Showcase, and then Supergirl in Action Comics number 252. And I could relate to her so well. In 1960, the JLA in Brave and the Bold. And then also I won a trip to Disneyland by finishing in the top 20 with Mercury News newspaper throwers or carriers, whatever they called us. My brother and I had paper routes. And in 1961, my first letter in comics was published in Mystery in Space number 69. And of course, my stunning memory of that year is Fantastic Four number 1, which I bought at the end of summer and was just thoroughly enchanted by how different it was from other comics. 1962 memory is comic books going up to 12 cents. That was frustrating. And seeing Johnny DC telling us kids to talk to our parents about inflation. And then, of course, Gold Key comics came about in 62, and there were so many wonderful Gold Keys. Somehow I missed Amazing Fantasy 15 with the first Spider-Man story, but I did get Spider-Man number 1 on the rack in 1963, and he quickly became one of my 5 most famous favorite characters, and I never missed an issue after that. And I did. It took me a few years, but I did find Amazing Fantasy 15 eventually. In 1964, I met a comic collector who was going into the Air Force, and he introduced me to the Rocket Splash, so I got to know fandom for the first time. And I had been aware of Jerry Bales and Roy Thomas and famous Bill Joe White and people like that wrote to DC, but I hadn't met anybody. Still thought I was the only comic book collector. I won a trip to Italy that year by being the carrier they chose to go the Parade magazine trip to Italy. And I bought a whole slew of Italian comic books that I still have. 1965 through the San Jose Mercury's Kids Classified was my last time eligible, so I put an ad in for free advertising comic books wanted. What do you have from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s? And guess who answered the ad? Bud Plant, who also lived on the other side of San Jose, about 10 miles away. And I was able to drive a car, but he wasn't because he's 4 years younger. So that became the start of our deep friendship. And I found out I wasn't the only comic book collector. 1966, I had my first professional article after I won the San Jose High School Journalism Contest. And the local weekly hired me to write features and sports. And I did an article on comic book collecting. Was my very first paid article in professional journalism. And also the first gathering of collectors I ever attended was in January, about the same time the Batman TV show debuted, in Oakland at the home of Rudy Franke, who was a very famous fanzine artist. And we had about 3 dozen collectors there talking, buying, and selling comics. And we also watched the Captain America serial in 16 millimeter film shown on a sheet attached to the garage door. So we got to see the 1943 Republic Captain America. 1967, I started driving and going on trips all over the country, and I met Rick Durrell, who had the best comic collection in America in Southern California, and I visited Cherokee Bookshop and Collector's Bookstore and Bond Street Books, and I became aware of just how many Golden Age comics were out there, bought as many as I could. In 1968, I became the first comic book collector ever to do individual superhero indexes for old comics, Golden Age. And that was, the first one was a Nidor comic index in 1968. That's the standard better thing like Black Terror and Fighting Yang. And we also, Bud and I and several other friends, opened what we still believe in March of 1968 was the first real pure comic book store in America. We did nothing but sell comics, and we were only a few blocks from San Jose State, where I was a sophomore. Bud was a sophomore in high school, and we all had a ball with this store, and we opened it because we not only wanted to sell comics, but what we really wanted to do is have people bring them in from their attics and basements and everything else. And boy, do we have some great comic books come into the store. And then we sold out to one of the partners about a year later. And anyway, the store was in downtown San Jose, and I signed a business license because I was the oldest responsible person. I was 20, and we had a wonderful time. In 1969, I created the Timely and MLJ superhero indexes, and I also was Phil Seuling's primary assistant on his first huge convention at the Statler Hilton in New York City. He had done a smaller one the year before, and then several other people like Dave Kaler, the comic book writer, and also Bernie Bubness and other famous fans had done John Benson. They'd done smaller conventions starting in 1964, and Marvel was the impetus for all that, of course. And I met Stan Lee that year, and then Hal Foster, famous artist, was our guest of honor, and I was his gopher, and that was a thrill. 1970, I attended the very first San Diego convention, a one-day convention in March at the basement of the El Cortez Hotel. Or no, maybe it was the U.S. Grant. There were two of them when they had the old conventions. I think it was the U.S. Grant now that I think about it. And then of course, they had the first three-day show in August of 1970. And I also attended a meeting with Bob Overstreet in 1970 at the Houston Con in 1970, and he had several of us there, Roy Benario and Mark Schooley and Earl Blair, and people who are unfortunately no longer with us. But we all agreed to create the first comic book price guide, and I gave Bob a terrific amount of information, gave him permission to use everything that I had in my books. And he was just great. I mean, what a wonderful guy. He went from a fairly primitive first Overstreet to the magnificent creation you see now, and he's still around. And 54 years later, but I'll never forget that first meeting was so cool.
Michelle, again, just wanted to thank you. It's been a pleasure to meet you and have you on the show, and we hope to talk real soon, okay?
I want to, and thank you so much. It's been a wonderful pleasure. Thank you so much.